This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers kicks off the show with K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken. The pair discuss ducks and the issues they can create, but also how people can get more in their area. Keeping the show going is Jason Warner, K-State Cow-Calf Extension Specialist, as he explains how nutritional needs of cattle shift as temperatures cool. K-State Dairy Specialist Mike Brouk ends today's show, encouraging dairy farmers to consult with their veterinarian to establish new pain management protocols, as the FDA warns against unapproved use of aspirin in lactating dairy cows. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Tuesday show with part of a Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast episode from K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken.
Welcome back to Fins, Fur, and Feathers. This week we've got an aquatics episode, and Joe, you want to talk about ducks, huh?
Yeah, I'm starting to get excited, getting a little bit cooler weather outside, and starting to get me excited about climbing into a duck stand or a duck blind. Not sure I'm excited to wake up at 3 or 4 in the morning, but excited to get out there and watch some sunrises, I guess. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about some waterfowl today. What kind of species we see. There's actually 27 different species that have been documented in Kansas. About 14 of those are known to nest in Kansas. So a lot of them we see, they're just flying by, flying overhead, or on their migration pattern. Most of the ducks we see are going to be in 3 main species. So we're going to see a lot of mallards. We're going to see a lot of blue-winged teal, and we're going to see a lot of wood ducks. And so those are the 3 main ones that we see, but there's a lot of diversity. So getting out there to a pond, lots of different ducks that you can see.
So these ducks, are they going to be around year-round, or are we looking for them during different times of the year? What are we thinking here?
We got some of both of those. So there are some species that are year-round residents. We see that really commonly with Canada geese, and so we see residents that stick around all year long, and we see other groups of waterfowl that are migrating. And so the migrating groups, we tend to see 2 main times of migration. So we have fall migration. People generally are thinking about that fall migration. Are they pushing down? Are there ducks out on the wetlands that I can go hunt type of deal? When are they coming through? We think about teal, smaller bodied ducks moving through, earlier in Kansas maybe. That's largely due to the photo period, so the amount of sunlight. But Kansas is located in the Central Flyway, and so there are a bunch of different ducks that are up in different portions of Canada or in the northern states, so North Dakota, South Dakota, and they're going to migrate down to their winter habitats, and they're going to stop in Kansas along the way, along that flight pattern down. For the most part, it doesn't matter if it's hot or cold, what the exact temperatures are. It matters more that photo period that's kind of driving them down. We see the opposite of that in the springs. And so in springtime, those ducks that have migrated south are now going to go back up north to their breeding habitats. That's usually a faster migration. So the theory out there is that they're trying to get up north, and there's some sort of evolutionary adaptation that the ones that get there sooner are going to have the better nesting ground. And so they don't make as many stops. Their flight speed, their ground speed is all faster going up north. And so having habitats during these 2 migrations where species can kind of stop, get rest, fill up on food or water if they need to is really important. And so that's when we'll see a lot of these different species in Kansas during that migration time.
So if we think about the waterfowl species that are going to be around here year-round, what's driving that?
The habitat that's available. Canada geese are a group, and you might know more about this than I do, but they're a group that, there really are 2 different populations, and their habitat use is quite different. So resident Canada geese tend to enjoy open green spaces, and migratory groups tend to prefer more of a wetland type habitat. And so seeing some of those difference, making sure that they have access to food, that they have access to cover, that they feel safe is really important. One of the other important things for when they're year-round is that they have the right type of nesting habitat. When we think about nesting, most of us, even my brain jumps to they must be in a pond or in a body of water, right? And a lot of these species actually can go, a mile or two away from the closest water and out into some sort of grassland. And some of these species are going to, have nests in both of those areas. So mallards are a good example of that. They can nest in grassland habitats, and they can nest in open water areas, right? And so that's kind of a neat overlap there where they can do both.
What about problems that waterfowl might cause for people?
Sure. I think, the biggest one is probably their fecal matter. And so if we get large groups of ducks that are walking around, HOAs call me quite often because they have a green space and it's just overrun by Canada geese, and people don't want to walk their dogs amongst all the droppings. And so that's probably the biggest one that I get. They're just in areas where they're in high densities, they're spending time on land, and we don't want to walk around the messiness. And so you get called for human-wildlife conflict a lot. You see other questions other than that?
Well, it tends to be geese that I get called the most about. I can't remember when the last time I had a call about a problem duck was, but like you said, the resident Canada geese hanging out in green space, they also will oftentimes nest in pots and flower beds and those sorts of things right at the entrance to a building.
Yep.
And when we've got a nesting pair of Canada geese, they get a little bit aggressive when people start encroaching on that nest. And so, we might have a goose that chases somebody or nips at them, and then we have to figure out what to do about that sort of conflict as well.
And so, there are a few things we can do. I know going out and oiling eggs is a common thing. We start to see those, and that's literally just taking oil and rubbing it on the eggs, and it blocks the pores of the eggs from being able to exchange gases and asphyxiates the developing embryos. And, you can in some cases get some depredation permits. I know there are some other things that are commonly done. What other advice would you have for folks in that situation?
Well, the egg oiling is the most common practice. And in urban areas, we do have some wildlife control folks who have that process of getting those permits down pat. And when we have these geese that are nesting in flower beds and nesting close to the entrance to a business, is that the geese will continue to attend that nest long enough that by the time they realize those eggs aren't going to hatch, they won't re-nest. And if we instead were to go in and just remove the eggs, they would re-nest. And so the problem persists longer than it does otherwise when we either oil the eggs or addle them. Addle them is another thing that's done to the eggs to reduce their hatchability. Basically, it's just shaking them up and scramble them inside the shell.
There are a lot of people out there that have a backyard pond and they want some ducks to be there. And so, thinking about how to get ducks there is always it's always fun because, there's nothing you can do if there aren't any ducks in the area.
Yeah.
But if they are there, one of the things is, leave them alone. So if you do see some ducks there, you see the goslings, they're really cute. People want to go take pictures and be by them. But if they don't feel safe in that habitat, if they think you're coming to catch them every time, they're not going to want to come back. And so encouraging them to nest enough food. And so when we talk about things like how much vegetation do I want in my pond? Do I want any vegetation? A lot of people think they don't, but if you want ducks, if you want wildlife, you want different species there, you're going to need to have some vegetation there, something for them to eat. So the amount there that they have, talking about feeding, it is illegal to bait ducks to hunt them. But I think that we can encourage food in that area, right? Do you know anything about that?
Yeah. One of the important things to remember is that, just placing a pile of food out is not habitat management.
Yeah.
So we can absolutely manage habitat. We just can't put an artificial food source out there to attract ducks and geese and other migratory birds like doves. So if we think about what's allowed, normal agricultural practices would be allowed. And that
sounds like some fancy jargon.
Yeah, that's pretty broad, but that's what's included in the regulations that are put forth by the federal government about these species. And so included under normal agricultural practices would be most of what we would do as a normal habitat management. So like if you want to encourage vegetation around your pond, most ponds that follow pond construction guidelines are really bad for managing for waterfowl. And that's because if you've got that 3-to-1 slope, it's hard to grow vegetation around the edge. And so one of the really common things that folks do, whether they're managing a pond or another kind of wetland for waterfowl, is to draw the water down either just before or during the growing season, so in the spring or early summer, and then that allows a whole bunch of vegetation to go ahead and sprout and start growing. And one of the advantages to managing that way is that we can sort of drive what sorts of plants are going to sprout out there based on when we draw it down, how slowly we draw it down, and all those sorts of things. So barnyard grass might be a species that you would see a lot of in Kansas when we're using that sort of management. It's something that people are striving for, and that's just wild millet. If we had a larger wetland system, maybe you have 20 acres, and in that 20 acres, you've got 10 acres that when everything comes up, you have about half barnyard grass and half smartweed. Well, that's a pretty good patch to keep. Yeah. But the other piece that's not barnyard grass and smartweed, well, that ends up being cuckleburs. Okay, so we could go out there and we could use disking to kill those cuckleburs and let something else come up behind it. Or we could spray it with a herbicide. Or we could mow off that stuff and have that be open water after it gets flooded again. In a crop field, we could plant a crop and then we could intentionally flood that crop, or we could allow that crop to flood naturally by having a water control structure that we just, put some stops back into, and that then floods it. Before you flooded it, you could do some normal agricultural management, like disking part of that crop back down, or even mowing part of that crop back down. That's why on a wildlife area, a lot of times they'll plant sunflowers and then go in there and mow them. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people think, well, that's baiting. No, that's actually included as a normal agricultural practice. Thanks, everybody, for listening, and we will talk to you again in a couple of weeks with a terrestrial episode.
Once again, that was Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken. You can find the full episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers by following the link in today's show notes on agtoday.net or by searching for Fins, Fur, and Feathers on the podcast streaming platform of your choice. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show talking about cold stress and nutrient requirement changes potentially for cattle with K-State Cow-Calf Extension Specialist Jason Warner. Jason, thanks for joining us today.
Hi, Shelby. Appreciate it. Appreciate the opportunity to be on as always.
Jason, when we're thinking about cold stress and how nutrient requirements might be changing a little bit, what's that level where it gets cold enough and we might be seeing those changes?
Yeah, so I guess first off, it seems a little odd maybe to be talking about cold stress as a topic here, but I think it's an important thing to be thinking about just from the standpoint as we always know that we get into this time of year, late November, early December timeframe, and we're always prone or at least more likely to get a pretty strong, severe weather system that will come through that time of year and just the general impact that has. And so we know that we're getting that time of year where we can have some cold stress on cattle, and it's just always, I think, a good thing to be thinking about more from just the standpoint of how we're gonna react to it is, I think, really the important thing that we want folks to be thinking about with it.
And when it comes to nutrients and making sure their cattle are being fed what they're needed, how might people react to that?
So I think one of the biggest things that we want folks to just keep in mind when we talk about the effects of cold stress, it's really from an energy standpoint. We think about all the other nutrients that we consider when we think about a nutrient program. Aside from water, we think about protein, energy, vitamins, and minerals really as the key fundamental nutrients there that we're going to focus on. And from a requirement standpoint, at least from what we've documented, at least from what's been published through research, we know that energy requirements will increase in response to cold stress, severe cold stress. And so I think it's an important thing to keep in mind that during that time period when we're making adjustments to a diet or to a ration program to offset the impact of severe winter cold stress, it's really primarily just the impact of energy, or we're focused on the topic of energy there that we're really going to want to be considering there. Protein and vitamins and minerals, those requirements, at least as we understand them, really don't change all that much. But really what happens is metabolic rate of that animal or her overall metabolism, the cow's overall metabolism, is going to increase in response to cold stress because that animal is using more energy just to maintain heat production, just to maintain their core body temperature. And so one thing that producers might often hear when cold stress is discussed is this idea or this concept of a lower critical temperature. And what we mean by that when we're talking about a lower critical temperature is we're talking about the point at which once we get beyond, or in this case with cold stress, below that temperature in terms of the effective ambient temperature, once we get below that point, that's when the animal starts to use more energy for maintaining heat production, maintaining core body temperature. And so what we have right now, our best published guidelines or our research data would suggest that we have guidelines for really 4 general lower critical temperature threshold points that once we get below those points, that's when we start to see an increase in energy requirements. So we can think about them in terms of whether an animal is wet or not, because we know that when we wet down that hide, we wet down that hair coat, that increases basically the ability for that air to get closer to the skin or to the hide of that animal, and we can cool that animal much more rapidly when that animal's wet, of course. And then depending on how much hair coat or how much hair length that animal has, that really dictates what that lower critical temperature is. So what we've determined over the course of time, or at least what our published data would suggest, is that for cattle that are wet, but if they're wet, they have a lower critical temperature of about 60 degrees Fahrenheit. If they're dry, but we would consider that they have a winter hair coat length, so more of a transition period hair coat length, the lower critical temperature there is estimated to be about 45 degrees dry. And if they have a winter hair coat, about 32 degrees. And if they have a really, really heavy, really thick winter hair coat, but again, they're dry, the lower critical temperature there is estimated to be about 18 degrees Fahrenheit. Keep in mind, those are just estimates, but based on the research data that's been published, those are the guidelines that we generally follow, that once we get beyond that point and we expect that we're going to have a significant amount of cold stress on that animal for a significant amount of time, that's when we really want to start using those guidelines as a recommendation, and that's how we can make some adjustments to the feeding program. And so really the general rule of thumb there is that for every degree of effective ambient temperature that we get below that lower critical temperature, if the animals are wet, if they've got a wet coat, it's an increase in energy for about 2% for every degree below that lower critical temperature. And if they're dry, it's an increase of about 1%. So those are just kind of the general guidelines that nutritionists and extension specialists generally follow based on the published recommendations that are out there for the impacts of cold stress and how it's going to impact the feeding program.
Cattle can be in a lot of different locations right now, and so how might a producer provide that energy to them?
So really the big thing that we have to go back and we have to think about is, okay, how can the plan adjust based on how we manage the feeding program? How can we make those changes and implement those changes? And really it goes back to what the overall program is there for that specific herd. So, just as an example, if we think about a situation, if we've got a set of cows, if they're running out on pasture and if they've got a dry winter hair coat, and so we estimate that they've got a lower critical temperature of 32 degrees Fahrenheit. If we have let's just say that we have a frontal system come through, or we have a time period for a couple, 2-3 days where we have an effective ambient temperature with the wind chill index of 15 degrees. So if we subtract those two, because it's the difference between the lower critical temperature and the effective temperature, so that would say, okay, we have about a 17-degree difference there in terms of that effective ambient temperature. So in that case, if that cow, again, if she has a dry winter coat, her energy needs would increase by about 17% in that situation. So let's just say that if we were assuming that animal was eating all that she could of free choice forage, free choice hay, and in that situation, if her energy needs increase by about 17%, if she was eating an average quality forage, if her diet was average quality, let's just say it was about 55% TDN on an energy basis, then her intake would have to increase by about 5 pounds per head per day in order to offset that energy need. And so in this case, if that cow, if she was already eating about 30 pounds per head per day on an as-is basis of forage, and her energy needs dictated that she needed to consume about 5 more pounds. In most situations, we would predict that during those cold stress events, voluntary intake will increase in many situations. And so in that situation where we've got a fairly modest or less severe situation with cold stress, oftentimes voluntary forage intake from the animals themselves will offset that increase in energy demand. But it's really when we get into those situations where we have a much more severe cold stress challenge and it's much more prolonged is when we may have to take some different situations there, or we may have to take a more proactive approach there.
What is that prolonged length of coldness, and how could producers handle it?
So be looking at the forecast. And so, if you can identify a time period, if we can say, okay, here over the next 5 days to maybe 10 days, we've got a time period in here where we're going to be looking at a pretty significant cold stress event that's going to be coming through. That's when, we probably need to start taking some proactive measures there. Certainly when you think about the day-to-day variation or the day-to-day fluctuation, being able to adjust your supplementation or adjust your feeding program to offset real minor changes is much more difficult to do practically, right? But I think when we get into those situations, if we've got extreme cold stress for a very long period of time, maybe 5 days to 10 days, certainly much longer than about a 2-week stretch of continued very severe cold weather. If we're having wind chill indexes of -20, -30, that sort of thing, that's when we really want to start using caution. And particularly when we think about cow herds or groups of cattle that are managed, if they don't have much access to wind protection, because that effective ambient temperature is always going to be a function of whatever the wind chill factor is, right? And so we know that if we can provide a windbreak, or those cattle have access to shelter, a place where they can get out of the wind, that's always gonna be very positive there and helpful. But when we're in those situations where cattle don't have much access to wind protection, I think about situations like open cornstalk fields or open crop residue fields that are flat and have very little protection there. Those are situations where we really want to use caution there. And if we can provide temporary windbreak structure, through hay bales or bringing trailers into the field, those types of practical things to get around that, those are certainly beneficial to do.
Jason, where can people find out more information on this topic?
So we've got a lot of really good resources available at our Extension Beef Cattle website, ksubeef.org. Of course, feel free to contact your local extension unit office or your area or state beef cattle specialist. Also, too, when we think about weather events and understanding the impact that has and looking for current up-to-date information, the Kansas Mesonet website is a great resource because there is a cattle comfort index tool that is on that website that allows you to be able to pick any place on the state, and you can look at real-time cattle comfort indexes or cattle cold stress or heat stress indexes. And so that's a really nice feature to be able to see what those values are and allow you to be able to determine what the general degree of cold stress is there to be able to make appropriate management recommendations.
Jason, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thanks, Shelby. Appreciate it as always.
That was K-State Cow-Calf Extension Specialist Jason Warner. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's milk lines. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk says the FDA is warning against unapproved use of aspirin for pain management for lactating dairy cows.
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning the use of aspirin in your dairy herds. I know as we think about pain control in our dairy herds, we might think of aspirin as a choice. However, as we look at the regulations around that, it is not a choice for our lactating dairy cows. And in fact, recently FDA has warned veterinarians against the use of unapproved aspirin in lactating dairy cows. So you might be wondering, well, I can go to my medicine cabinet in the house and get some aspirin and take it for myself, so why can't I give it to my dairy animals? Well, there's a very good reason for that. Number one, there is no approval for the use of aspirin or any aspirin product in lactating dairy cows. You see, the testing has not been done to establish the appropriate doses nor the appropriate withdrawals for meat and milk. So therefore, we should not be utilizing aspirin in our treatment programs of our lactating dairy cattle. So, here are some suggestions that I might have for you as you think about whether or not you have something you need to change in your operation. Number one, review your treatment protocols. If you have a treatment protocol for lactating dairy cows that includes the use of aspirin, you need to make that change now rather than later, and find another product that could be utilized for that. In order to do that, you're going to need to visit with your herd veterinarian, and hopefully you have established a client relationship with that veterinarian, as that is also required as we have these discussions. In visiting and consulting with your veterinarian, determine what other products you might be able to utilize for pain management in lactating dairy cattle. There are a few choices out there. They will probably be more expensive than aspirin, but they are approved and legal for use in lactating dairy cattle. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy producers to carefully review their treatment protocols for lactating dairy cattle and find a substitute for aspirin in those protocols.
Thanks, Mike. And while we have a moment, the Agriculture Secretary recently announced additional testing measures of milk for H5N1 in dairy cattle. Rod Bain has more.
A more extensive testing regime of milk for the potential H5N1 virus recently announced by the Agriculture Department. Secretary Tom Vilsack says the impetus, in part, comes from both recent developments in California.
We've recently seen the introduction of H5N1 in California, and for a period of time we thought it was relatively contained in that state, but we've obviously seen recently a significant number of increases in the number of herds that have been impacted and affected, despite efforts on the part of California,
as well as prevention efforts in Colorado.
We saw the state of Colorado institute a fairly aggressive testing regime, and the result of that testing regime allowed them to identify precisely where the virus was, to utilize a number of tools, including advanced biosecurity, and as a result, they are now virus-free.
So how will USDA's expanded testing regime work?
We will first test silos. We'll go to processors who have accumulated significant amounts of milk product. We'll test that milk. So testing will give us an opportunity to get maybe ahead, if you will.
Testing begins this month in states with reported cases of H5N1 in dairy cattle.
Get a clear idea of where in the states that currently have the virus, whether it's expanded or whether there are areas of the state that we need to address in terms of biosecurity.
Testing will eventually expand in tiered stages to all 50 states.
We test the silos. If it turns out that there's virus, we'll then begin the process of going to more specific testing, bulk tank testing on farm, so that we can identify exactly where the virus might be. We're in the process of putting together the formal guidance as to how exactly this is going to work. But to do that, we want to make sure we're working collaboratively with our state partners, the state veterinarians, the state ag commissioners and secretaries and directors, so that we get their input in terms of how best to craft this. But I think you're going to find that there's a genuine desire and interest to do this on the part of most folks, and to be able to hopefully begin the process of replicating what we have in Colorado.
I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.